Frankenstein by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelly. To Mrs. Saville, England. August 5th. My dear Margaret, so strange an accident has happened to us that I cannot forbear recording it. Last Monday, July 31st, we were nearly surrounded by ice, which closed in the ship on all sides, scarcely leaving her the sea room in which she floated. Our situation was somewhat dangerous, especially as we were compassed round by a very thick fog. My mind began to grow watchful with anxious thoughts, when a strange sight suddenly attracted our attention. We perceived a low carriage, fixed on a sledge and drawn by dogs, pass on at the distance of half a mile. A being which had the shape of a man, but apparently of gigantic stature, sat in the sledge and guided the dogs. About 2 hours after this occurrence, we heard the ground sea, and before night the ice broke and freed our ship. We lay to until the morning, fearing to encounter in the dark those large loose masses which float about after the breaking up of the ice. As soon as it was light, I went upon deck and found all the sailors busy on one side of the vessel, apparently talking to someone in the sea. It was a sledge, like that we had seen before, which had drifted towards us on a large fragment of ice. There was a human being within it whom the sailors were persuading to enter the vessel. His limbs were nearly frozen, and his body dreadfully emaciated by fatigue and suffering. We carried him into my cabin, wrapped him up in blankets, and placed him near the chimney of the kitchen stove. By slow degrees he recovered and ate a little soup, which restored him wonderfully. When asked why he had come so far upon the ice in so strange a vehicle, he replied, "To seek one who fled from me." "And did the man whom you pursued travel in the same fashion?" "Yes." "The day before we picked you up, we saw some dogs drawing a sledge with a man in it across the ice." This aroused the stranger's attention, and he asked a multitude of questions. Soon after this, he inquired if I thought that the breaking up of the ice had destroyed the other sledge. I replied that I could not answer with any degree of certainty, for the ice had not broken until near midnight, and the traveler might have arrived at a place of safety before that time. That was all the assurance I could give the poor man. I shall continue my journal concerning the stranger at intervals, should I have any fresh incidents to record. Margaret, aside from this unusual encounter, time passes very slowly here. Remember me to all my English friends. Your affectionate brother, Robert Walton. August 19. The stranger has gradually improved in health, but is very silent, and appears uneasy when anyone except myself enters his cabin. Yesterday he said to me, "You seek for knowledge and wisdom, as I once did, and I ardently hope that the gratification of your wishes may not be a serpent to sting you, as mine has been." Prepare to hear of occurrences which are usually deemed marvelous. I am by birth a Genevese, and my family is one of the most distinguished of that republic. My father passed his younger days perpetually occupied by the affairs of his country. It was not until the decline of life that he became a husband and father. There was a considerable difference between the ages of my parents, but this circumstance seemed to unite them only closer in bonds of devoted affection. I was born at Naples, and I remained for several years their only child. When I was 5 years old, we had an excursion beyond the frontiers of Italy. The benevolent disposition of my parents often made them enter the cottages of the poor. This, to my mother, was a passion. One day, when my father had gone to Milan, my mother and I visited the home of a peasant and his wife, who had 5 very young children. Among these, there was one which appeared of a different stock. The peasant woman, perceiving that my mother fixed eyes of wonder and admiration on this lovely girl, shared her story. She was the daughter of a Milanese nobleman, and her mother, a German, had died on giving birth. The infant had been placed with these good people to nurse. Her father was one who exerted himself to obtain the liberty of his country. He became the victim of his weakness, and died not long after his wife. His property was confiscated, and the fair child continued with her foster parents and bloomed in their rude abode. The peasant man and wife were fond of the sweet orphan. Her presence had seemed a blessing to them, but it would be unfair to her to keep her in poverty and want when Providence afforded her such powerful protection. My parents consulted their village priest, and the result was that Elizabeth Lavenza became the inmate of my parents' house and the adored companion of all my occupations. We called each other familiarly by the name of cousin. On the birth of a second son, my parents gave up entirely their wandering life and fixed themselves in their native country. We possessed a house in Geneva. Elizabeth was of a calmer and more concentrated disposition. I was capable of a more intense application and was more deeply smitten with the thirst for knowledge. Whether it was the outward substance of things or the mysterious soul of man that occupied me, my inquiries were directed to the physical secrets of the world. My father was not scientific, and I was left to struggle with a child's blindness, added to a student's thirst for knowledge. I entered with the greatest diligence into the search of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, but the latter soon obtained my undivided attention. When I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should become a student at the University of Ingolstadt. My departure was therefore fixed at an early date, but before the day resolved upon could arrive, the first misfortune of my life occurred. My mother became ill with fever, which was accompanied by the most alarming symptoms, and the looks of her medical attendants prognosticated the worst event. She died calmly, and her countenance expressed affection even in death. My mother was dead, but we had still duties which we ought to perform. We must continue our course with the rest and learn to think ourselves fortunate whilst one remains. Not long after I came to the university, I ventured into the lecturing room of M. Waldman. I was mesmerized by his teaching. He concluded by saying, "The ancient teachers of science promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that metals cannot be transmuted, and that the elixir of life is a foolish fancy. But these philosophers, whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt, and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles." I, Victor Frankenstein, felt as if, one by one, the various keys were touched which formed the mechanism of my being, and soon my mind was filled with one thought, one purpose. So much has been done, yet far more will I achieve. I will unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation. From this day, natural philosophy became nearly my sole occupation. I attended the lectures and cultivated the acquaintance of the men of science. My application gained strength, and soon I became so eager that the stars often disappeared in the light of morning, whilst I was yet engaged in my laboratory. 2 years passed in this manner, during which I paid no visit to Geneva. When I had become as well acquainted with the theory and practice of natural philosophy as depended on the lessons of any of the professors at Ingolstadt, I thought of returning to my native town, when an incident happened that protracted my stay. One of the phenomena which had peculiarly attracted my attention was the structure of the human life. Whence did the principle of life proceed? I saw how the fine form of man was degraded and wasted. I beheld the corruption of death succeed to the blooming cheek of life. I examined and analyzed all the minutiae of causation, as exemplified in the change from life to death. After months of incredible labor and fatigue, I became capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. Such power that was within my hands! I hesitated a long time concerning the manner in which I should employ it. Although I possessed this capacity, yet to prepare a frame for the reception of it remained a work of inconceivable difficulty. It was with these feelings that I began the creation of a human being. As the minuteness of the parts formed a great hindrance to my speed, I resolved to make the being of a gigantic stature. After having spent months in collecting and arranging my materials, I began. Life and death appeared to me ideal bounds. I thought that if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I could renew life where death had devoted the body to corruption. These thoughts supported my spirits, while I pursued my undertaking with unremitting ardor. Sometimes, on the very brink of certainty, I failed. Yet still I clung to the hope which the next day or the next hour might realize. Winter, spring, and summer passed away during my labors. Now every day showed me more plainly how well I had succeeded. Still every night I was oppressed by a slow fever, and I became nervous to a most painful degree. On a rainy November night, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. My candle was nearly burnt out, when I saw the dull yellow eyes of the creature open. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black. His watery eyes seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set. I had worked 2 years for the sole purpose of creating life. For this I had deprived myself of rest and health. Now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror filled my heart. I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber. I threw myself on the bed, endeavoring to seek a few moments of forgetfulness. I slept, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I started from sleep with horror. Then, by the dim and yellow light of the moon, I beheld the miserable monster whom I had created. His eyes were fixed on me. His jaw opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped. I took refuge in the courtyard belonging to the house which I inhabited, where I remained during the rest of the night. Morning at length dawned, and I then reflected that the creature whom I had left in my apartment might still be there. I darted up towards my own room and threw the door forcibly open, but nothing appeared. The apartment was empty. I was unable to contain myself. It was not joy only that possessed me. I felt my flesh tingle and my pulse beat rapidly. I jumped over the chairs, clapped my hands, and laughed aloud. But then, in feverish haze, I believed to see the monster come into the room. I imagined that he seized me. I struggled furiously and fell to the ground, and did not recover my senses for a long time. This was the commencement of a nervous fever which confined me for several months. By very slow degrees I recovered. From then on, the sight of a chemical instrument would renew all the agony of my nervous symptoms. I removed all my apparatus from my view and changed my apartment. Summer passed away, and I planned to return to Geneva at the latter end of autumn. But being delayed by several accidents, winter and snow arrived, the roads were deemed impassable, and my journey was delayed until spring. On a beautiful day in May, I received a letter from my father, which was to fix the date of my departure. My dear Victor, you have probably waited impatiently for a letter to fix the date of your return to us. And now, Victor, I must prepare you for woeful news. Your sweet brother William is dead. Victor, he is murdered. Upon learning of his death, Elizabeth fainted. When she was restored, it was only to weep and sigh. She told me that same evening William had teased her to let him wear a very valuable miniature that she possessed of your mother. This picture is gone, and was doubtless the temptation which urged the murderer to the deed. Come, dearest Victor, you alone can console Elizabeth. Your father, Alphonse Frankenstein. I threw the letter on the table, covered my face with my hands, and wept. Then I quickly gathered a few belongings and departed for home. It was completely dark when I arrived in the environs of Geneva. The gates of the town were already shut, and I was obliged to pass the night in Secaron. As I could not pass through the town, I was obliged to cross the lake in a boat to arrive in Plains Palais. During this short voyage, I saw the lightning playing on the summit of Mont Blanc in the most beautiful figures. The storm approached rapidly, and on landing, I ascended a low hill that I might observe its progress. The thunder burst with a terrific crash over my head. Vivid flashes of lightning illuminated the lake. Then, for an instant, everything seemed of a pitchy darkness until the eye recovered itself from the preceding flash. Then I perceived a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees. A flash of lightning illuminated the object. Its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect instantly informed me that it was the wretch to whom I had given life. The figure passed me quickly, and I lost it in the gloom. What did he there? Could he be the murderer of my brother? I could not doubt it. No one can conceive the anguish I suffered during the remainder of the night. Day dawned. It was about 5 in the morning when I entered my father's house. I went into the library to attend their usual hour of rising. Father had heard me arrive and entered the room. He endeavored to welcome me cheerfully, and we exchanged our mournful greeting. You come to us now to share a misery which nothing can alleviate. Our dear Elizabeth requires your consolation. She accused herself of having caused the death of my brother, but since the murderer has been discovered— The murderer discovered? How can that be? I saw him. He was free last night. I do not know what you mean, replied my father, but to us the discovery we have made completes our misery. Who would credit that Justine Moritz, who was so amiable and fond of all the family, could suddenly become so capable of so frightful, so appalling a crime? Justine Moritz? Is she the accused? No one believes it, surely. No one did at first, but several circumstances came out that have almost forced conviction upon us. She will be tried today." He then related that, the morning on which the murder of poor William had been discovered, Justine had been taken ill and confined to her bed for several days. During this interval, one of the servants discovered in her pocket the picture of my mother, which had been judged to be the temptation of the murderer. The servant showed it to a magistrate, and upon their deposition, Justine was apprehended. On being charged, the poor girl confirmed the suspicion by her extreme confusion of manner. I replied earnestly, "My dear father, you are mistaken. Justine is innocent. If she is, God forbid that she should suffer as guilty. I sincerely hope that she will be acquitted." We were soon joined by Elizabeth. "Your arrival," said she, "fills me with hope. Our misfortune is doubly hard to us. We have not only lost that darling boy, but poor Justine is to be torn away by even a worse fate." "She is innocent, my Elizabeth," said I, "and that shall be proved. Fear nothing, but let your spirits be cheered by the assurance of her acquittal." "How kind and generous you are! Everyone else believes in her guilt, and that made me wretched, for I knew that it was impossible." She wept. We passed a few sad hours until 11 o'clock, when the trial was to commence. When Justine entered the court, she quickly discovered where we were seated. A tear dimmed her eye when she saw us, and a look of sorrowful affection seemed to attest her utter guiltlessness. The trial began, and after the advocate against her had stated the charge, witnesses were called. Several strange facts combined against her. She had been out the whole of the night on which the murder had been committed, and towards morning had been perceived by a market woman not far from the spot where William had been found. The woman asked her what she did there, but she looked very strangely and only returned an unintelligible answer. She returned to the house about 8 o'clock, and when one inquired where she had passed the night, she replied that she had been looking for the child. When shown the body, she fell into violent hysterics and kept her bed for several days. The picture was then produced which the servant had found in her pocket. A murmur of horror and indignation filled the court. Justine was called on for her defense. "God knows," she said, "how entirely I am innocent. I rest my innocence on a plain and simple explanation of the facts." She then related that she had passed the evening of the night on which the murder had been committed at the house of an aunt at Chenay, a village situated at about a league from Geneva. On her return, she met a man who asked her if she had seen anything of the child who was lost. She was alarmed by this account and passed several hours in looking for him, unable to return before the gates of Geneva were shut. She was forced to remain several hours of the night in a barn. Most of the night she spent watching. Towards morning she believed that she slept for a few minutes. Some steps disturbed her, and she awoke. It was dawn, and she continued her search for my brother. That she had been bewildered when questioned by the market woman was not surprising, since she had passed a sleepless night and the fate of poor William was yet uncertain. Concerning the picture, she could give no account. My own agitation and anguish was extreme during the whole trial. When I perceived that the popular voice and the countenances of the judges had already condemned dear Justine, I rushed out of the court in agony. In the morning I went to the court. The ballots had been thrown. They were all black, and Justine was condemned. I hastened to return home, and Elizabeth eagerly demanded the result. And on the morrow, Justine died. From the tortures of my own heart, I turned to contemplate the deep and voiceless grief of my Elizabeth. This also was my doing. I had begun life with benevolent intentions, and thirsted for the moment when I should make myself useful to my fellow beings. Now I was seized by remorse and guilt. Sometimes the whirlwind passions of my soul drove me to seek relief from my intolerable sensations. It was during an access of this kind that I suddenly left my home and sought to forget myself and my sorrows. At length I arrived at the village of Chamonix. Exhaustion succeeded to the extreme fatigue both of body and of mind. I retired to rest. When I awoke, the rain was pouring in torrents, and thick mists hid the summits of the mountains. My mule was brought to the door, and I resolved to ascend to the summit of Montanvert. The ascent is precipitous, but the path is cut into continual and short windings, which enable you to surmount the perpendicularity of the mountain. It was nearly noon when I arrived at the top of the ascent. From the side where I now stood, Montanvert was exactly opposite. I gazed on this stupendous scene. I exclaimed, "Wandering spirits, allow me this faint happiness, or take me away from the joys of life." As I said this, I beheld the figure of a man at some distance, advancing towards me. He bounded over the crevices in the ice, among which I had walked with caution. I perceived that it was the wretch whom I had created. I trembled with rage and horror. "Devil!" I exclaimed, "do you dare approach me? Begone, vile insect!" "I expected this reception," said the daemon. "All men hate the wretched, yet you, my creator, detest and spurn thy creature." I sprang on him, but he easily eluded me and said, "O Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice and even thy clemency and affection is most due. There can be no community between you and me. Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity. But am I not miserably alone? Let your compassion be moved. Listen to my tale. When you have heard that, abandon or commiserate me, as you shall judge that I deserve." As he said this, he led the way across the ice. We crossed the ice and ascended the opposite rock, where we entered into a hut. And, seating myself by the fire, he thus began. "It is with considerable difficulty that I remember the original era of my being. Darkness had come over me, but hardly had I felt this when, by opening my eyes, the light poured in upon me again. The light became more and more oppressive to me. I sought a place where I could receive shade. This was the forest near Ingolstadt, and here I lay by the side of a brook, resting from my fatigue. It was dark when I awoke. I felt cold also. Before I had quitted your apartment, on a sensation of cold, I had covered myself with some clothes, and these were insufficient to secure me from the dews of night. I was a helpless wretch. I knew and could distinguish nothing. I sat down and wept. Soon I beheld a radiant form rise from among the trees. It was the moon. It enlightened my path, and I went out in search of food. I was still cold when under one of the trees I found a huge cloak, with which I covered myself and sat down upon the ground. I felt light and hunger and thirst and darkness. Innumerable sounds rang in my ears, and on all sides various scents saluted me. Several changes of day and night passed. I began to observe the forms that surrounded me. Sometimes I tried to imitate the pleasant songs of the birds, but was unable. My sensations had by this time become distinct, and my mind perceived every day new ideas. But food became scarce, and I often spent the whole day searching for a few acorns. I resolved to quit the place that I inhabited, to seek for one where the wants I experienced would be more easily satisfied. Wrapping myself up in my cloak, I struck across the wood. A great fall of snow had taken place, and I found my feet chilled by the cold substance that covered the ground. I proceeded across the fields for several hours, until I arrived at a village with many huts, cottages, and stately houses. One of the best of these I entered. I had hardly placed my foot within the door before the children shrieked, and one of the women fainted. The whole village was roused. Some fled, some attacked me, until grievously bruised by stones and other kinds of weapons, I escaped to the country and took refuge in a low hovel. This hovel joined a small cottage, but I dared not enter it. It was dry inside, and I found it an agreeable shelter from the snow and rain. As soon as morning dawned, I crept from my hovel that I might view the adjacent cottage and discover if I could remain in the habitation I had found. It was situated against the back of a cottage. One part was open, and by that I had crept in, but now I covered every crevice by which I might be perceived with stones and wood. Having thus arranged my dwelling and carpeted it with clean straw, I retired, for I saw the figure of a man at a distance. The floor was a little raised, so that it was kept perfectly dry, and by its vicinity to the chimney of the cottage it was tolerably warm. I found that one of the windows of the cottage had formerly occupied a part of it, but the panes had been filled up with wood. In one of these was a small and almost imperceptible chink through which the eye could just penetrate. Through this crevice a small room was visible, clean, but very bare of furniture. In one corner, near a small fire, sat an old man. A young girl was occupied in arranging the cottage, but presently she took something out of a drawer, which employed her hands, and she sat down beside the old man, who, taking up an instrument, began to play. He played a sweet, mournful air, which drew tears from the eyes of his amiable companion, of which the old man took no notice until she sobbed audibly. He then pronounced a few sounds, and the fair creature knelt at his feet. Soon after this, a young man entered, bearing on his shoulders a load of wood. The girl, taking some of the wood into the cottage, placed it on the fire. Then she went into the garden for some roots and plants, which she placed in water, and then upon the fire. She continued her work, whilst the young man went into the garden and appeared busily employed in digging and pulling up roots. After about an hour, he returned to the cottage, and they sat down to eat. In the evening, the old man again took up the instrument. The family, after having been thus occupied for a time, retired to rest. They arose the next morning. The young woman arranged the cottage and prepared the food, and the youth departed after the first meal. This day was passed in the same routine as that which preceded it. The old man, whom I soon perceived to be blind, employed his leisure hours on his instrument or in contemplation. The younger cottagers performed towards him every little office of affection and duty with gentleness, but they were not entirely happy. A considerable period elapsed before I discovered one of the causes of the unhappiness of this family. It was poverty. I had been accustomed during the night to steal a part of their store for my own consumption, but when I found that in doing this I inflicted pain on the cottagers, I abstained and satisfied myself with berries, nuts. I found that the youth spent a great part of each day in collecting wood for the family fire, and during the night I often took his tools and brought home firing sufficient for the consumption of several days. I found that these people possessed a method of communicating their experience and feelings to one another by articulate sounds, but I was unable to unravel the mystery of their reference. After quite some time, I discovered the names that were given to some of the most familiar objects of discourse, words like fire, milk, bread, and wood. I learned also the names of the cottagers. The old man was father, the girl was called sister or Agatha, and the youth Felix, brother, or son. I distinguished several other words without being able to understand or apply them. I spent the winter in this manner. The old man often endeavored to encourage his children to cast off their melancholy. I generally found that Agatha's countenance and tone were more cheerful after having listened to her father. Felix was always the saddest of the group. When Felix did not work, and as there was little to do in the frosty season, he read to the old man and Agatha. This reading puzzled me at first, but by degrees I discovered that he uttered many of the same sounds when he read as when he talked. I conjectured that he found on the paper signs for speech which he understood, and I longed to know them. I perceived that, although I longed to discover myself to the cottagers, I ought not to make the attempt until I had first become master of their language, which knowledge might enable me to make them overlook the deformity of my figure. My mode of life in my hovel was uniform. During the morning I attended the motions of the cottagers, and when they were dispersed in various occupations, I slept. When they slept, I went into the woods and collected my own food and fuel for the cottage. My thoughts now became more active, and I longed to discover the motives and feelings of these lovely creatures. I thought that it might be in my power to restore happiness to them. The pleasant showers and genial warmth of spring soon came. My spirits were elevated. The past was blotted from my memory. The present was tranquil, and the future gilded by rays of hope and of joy. It was on one of these days when someone tapped at the door of the cottage. It was a lady, accompanied by a countryman as a guide. She was dressed in a dark suit and covered with a thick black veil. When she saw Felix, she threw up her veil, and I beheld a countenance of angelic beauty and expression. Felix seemed ravished with delight when he saw her. His eyes sparkled as his cheek flushed with pleasure. He dismissed her guide and conducted her into the cottage. I soon perceived that although the stranger uttered articulate sounds and appeared to have a language of her own, she was neither understood by nor herself understood the cottagers. Felix seemed peculiarly happy, and with smiles of delight welcomed this Arabian lady called Scifi. Presently I found, by the frequent recurrence of some sound which the stranger repeated after them, that she was endeavoring to learn their language. And the idea occurred to me that I should make use of the same instructions to the same end. The days now passed as peaceably as before, with the sole alteration that the joy had taken place of sadness in the countenances of my friends. Scifi was always gay and happy. She and I improved rapidly in the knowledge of language, so that in 2 months I began to comprehend most of the words uttered by my protectors. My days were spent in close attention that I might more speedily master the language. While I improved in speech, I also learned the science of letters as it was taught to the stranger, and this opened before me a wide field for wonder and delight. The book from which Felix instructed Scifi was Volney's Runes of Empires. Through this work I obtained a knowledge of history and a view of the several empires at present existing in the world. It gave me an insight into the manners, governments, and religions of the different nations of the earth. Every conversation of the cottagers now opened new wonders to me. While I listened to the instructions which Felix bestowed upon the Arabian, the strange system of human society was explained to me. Of what a strange nature is knowledge! I admired virtue and good feelings and loved the gentle manners and amiable qualities of my cottagers, but I was shut out from intercourse with them, except through means which I obtained by stealth. One night during my accustomed visit to the neighboring wood, where I collected my own food and brought home firing for my protectors, I found on the ground a leather portmanteau containing several articles of dress and some books. Fortunately, the books were written in the language, the elements of which I had acquired at the cottage. They consisted of Paradise Lost, a volume of Plutarch's Lives, and the Sorrows of Werther. The possession of these treasures gave me extreme delight. I now continually studied and exercised my mind upon these histories. As I read, I applied much personally to my own feelings and condition. I found myself similar, yet at the same time strangely unlike to the beings concerning whom I read and to whose conversation I was a listener. I sympathized with and partly understood them, but I was unformed in mind. I was dependent on none and related to none. What did this mean? Who was I? What was I? Whence did I come? What was my destination? These questions continually recurred, but I was unable to solve them. I contemplated the virtues of the cottagers. I persuaded myself that when they should become acquainted with my admiration of their virtues, they would be compassionate to me and overlook my personal deformity. I resolved to fit myself for an interview with them, which would decide my fate. Autumn passed thus. I turned with more attention towards the cottagers. The more I saw of them, the greater became my desire to claim their protection and kindness. My heart yearned to be known and loved by these amiable creatures. The winter advanced. My attention at this time was solely directed towards my plan of introducing myself into the cottage of my protectors. I resolved that I was to enter the dwelling when the blind old man should be alone. I had sagacity enough to discover that the unnatural hideousness of my person was the chief object of horror with those who had formerly beheld me. My voice, although harsh, had nothing terrible in it. I thought, therefore, that if in the absence of his children I could gain the goodwill and mediation of the old de Lacy, I might by his means be tolerated by my younger protectors. One day Scifi, Agatha, and Felix departed on a long country walk. When his children had departed, he took up his guitar and played several mournful but sweet airs. My heart beat quick. This was the hour and moment of trial which would decide my hopes or realize my fears. All was silent in and around the cottage. I removed the planks which I had placed before my hovel to conceal my retreat, and I approached the door of their cottage. I knocked. "Come in," said the old man. "Pardon this intrusion," said I. "I am a traveler in want of a little rest. You would greatly oblige me if you would allow me to remain a few minutes before the fire." "Enter," said de Lacy, "and I will try to relieve your wants. But as I am blind, I am afraid I shall find it difficult to procure food for you. I have food. It is warmth and rest only that I need." I sat down, and a silence ensued. I knew that every minute was precious to me, yet I remained irresolute in what manner to commence the interview when the old man addressed me. "By your language, stranger, I suppose you are my countryman. Are you French?" "No, but I was educated by a French family and understand that language only. I am now going to claim the protection of some friends whom I sincerely love and of whose favor I have some hopes." "Are they Germans?" "No, they are French. But let us change the subject. I am an unfortunate and deserted creature. I look around and I have no relation or friend upon earth. These amiable people to whom I go have never seen me and know little of me. I am full of fears, for if I fail there, I am an outcast in the world forever." "Do not despair. To be friendless is indeed to be unfortunate. But the hearts of men, when unprejudiced by any obvious self-interest, are full of brotherly love and charity. Rely therefore on your hopes, and if these friends are good and amiable, do not despair. They are kind, but unfortunately they are prejudiced against me. I have good dispositions, but a fatal prejudice clouds their eyes, and where they ought to see a feeling and kind friend, they behold only a detestable monster." "That is indeed unfortunate. Cannot you undeceive them?" "I am about to undertake that task. I tenderly love these friends. I have, unknown to them, been for many months in the habits of daily kindness toward them. But they believe that I wish to injure them, and it is that prejudice which I wish to overcome." "Where do these friends reside?" "Near this spot." The old man paused and then continued, "If you will unreservedly confide to me the particulars of your tale, I perhaps may be of use in undeceiving them. There is something in your words which persuades me that you are sincere. It will afford me true pleasure to be in any way serviceable to a human creature." "I thank you and accept your generous offer. I trust that by your aid I shall not be driven from the society and sympathy of your fellow creatures." "Heaven forbid! I also am unfortunate. I and my family have been condemned, although innocent. Therefore, I feel for your misfortunes." "How can I thank you? From your lips first have I heard the voice of kindness directed towards me, and your present humanity assures me of success with those friends whom I am on the point of meeting." "May I know the names and residence of those friends?" I paused. This was the moment of decision. I struggled for firmness sufficient to answer him, but the effort destroyed all my remaining strength. I sank on the chair and sobbed aloud. At that moment I heard the steps of my younger protectors. I seized the hand of the old man and cried, "Save and protect me! You and your family are the friends whom I seek. Do not you desert me in the hour of trial." "Great God!" exclaimed the old man. "Who are you?" At that instant the cottage door was opened, and Felix, Scifi, and Agatha entered. Who can describe their horror and consternation on beholding me? Agatha fainted, and Scifi rushed out of the cottage. Felix darted forward, and with supernatural force tore me from his father, to whose knees I clung. He dashed me to the ground and struck me with a stick. My heart sank within me as with bitter sickness. Overcome by pain and anguish, I quitted the cottage, and in the general tumult escaped unperceived. When night came, I quitted my retreat and wandered in the wood. Oh, what a miserable night I passed! All save I were at rest or in enjoyment. I became fatigued with excess of bodily exertion and sank on the damp grass in the sick impotence of despair. The sun rose. I heard the voices of men and knew that it was impossible to return to my retreat during that day. The pleasant sunshine and the pure air of day restored me to some degree of tranquility. It was apparent that my conversation had interested the father in my behalf, and I was a fool in having exposed my person to his children. I ought to have familiarized the old de Lacy to me, and by degrees to have discovered myself to the rest of his family. After much consideration, I resolved to return to the cottage, seek the old man, and buy my representations with him to my party. These thoughts calmed me, and in the afternoon I sank into a profound sleep. I awoke, and finding that it was already night, I crept forth from my hiding place and went in search of food. When my hunger was appeased, I directed my steps toward the well-known path that conducted to the cottage. I crept into my hovel and remained in silent expectation of the accustomed hour when the family arose. But in the morning, the cottagers did not appear. After some time, Felix approached with another man. I waited anxiously to discover the meaning of these unusual appearances. "Do you consider," said his companion, "that you will be obliged to pay 3 months' rent and to lose the produce of your garden? I ask that you will take some days to consider of your determination." "It is utterly useless," replied Felix. "We can never again inhabit your cottage. The life of my father is in the greatest danger. My wife and my sister will never recover from their horror. I entreat you not to reason with me any more." He and his companion entered the cottage, in which they remained for a few minutes and then departed. I never saw any of the family of de Lacy more. I continued for the remainder of the day in my hovel. My protectors had departed and had broken the only link that held me to the world. For the first time the feelings of revenge and hatred filled my bosom. I bent my mind towards injury and death. As the night advanced, a fierce wind arose from the woods and quickly dispersed the clouds. The blast tore along like a mighty avalanche and produced a kind of insanity in my spirits. I lighted the dry branch of a tree and danced around the cottage. Then, with a loud scream, I fired the cottage. The wind fanned the fire, and the cottage was quickly enveloped by the flames. Then I quitted the scene and sought for refuge in the woods. I resolved to fly far from the scene of my misfortunes. But to me, hated and despised, every country must be equally horrible. At length, the thought of you crossed my mind. I learned from your papers that you were my father, and to whom could I apply with more fitness than to him who had given me life? You had mentioned Geneva as the name of your native town, and towards this place I resolved to proceed. I knew that I must travel in a southwesterly direction to reach my destination. I did not know the names of the towns that I was to pass through, but I did not despair. It was late in autumn when I quitted the district where I had so long resided. I traveled only at night. Nature decayed around me. Rain and snow poured around me. The surface of the earth was hard and chill, and I found no shelter. I generally rested during the day and traveled only when I was secured by night from the view of man. But my toils now drew near a close, and in 2 months from this time I reached the environs of Geneva. At this time a slight sleep relieved me from the pain of reflection, which was disturbed by the approach of a beautiful child who came running into the recess I had. As I gazed on him, an idea seized me that this little creature had lived too short a time to have imbibed a horror of deformity. If I could seize him and educate him as my companion, I should not be so desolate in this peopled earth. Urged by this impulse, I seized on the boy and drew him towards me. As soon as he beheld my form, he placed his hands before his eyes and uttered a shrill scream. I drew his hand from his face and said, "Child, I do not intend to hurt you. Listen to me." He struggled violently. "Let me go," he cried. "Monster! Ugly wretch! Let me go, or I will tell my papa." "Boy, you will never see your father again. You must come with me." "Hideous monster! Let me go! My papa is a syndic. He is Frankenstein. He will punish you." "Frankenstein? You belong to him towards whom I have sworn eternal revenge. You shall be my first victim." The child still struggled and loaded me with epithets which carried despair to my heart. I grasped his throat, and in a moment he lay forever silent at my feet. I gazed on my victim, and I exclaimed, "I too can create desolation. My enemy is not invulnerable. This death will carry despair to him." As I fixed my eyes on the child, I saw something glittering on his breast. It was a portrait of a most lovely woman. For a few moments I gazed with delight on her dark eyes and her lovely lips. But presently my rage returned. I remembered that I was forever deprived of the delights that such beautiful creatures could bestow. I left that spot, and seeking a more secluded hiding place, I entered a barn which had appeared to me to be empty. A woman was sleeping on some hay. Here, I thought, is one of those whose joy-imparting smiles are bestowed on all but me. The sleeper stirred. A thrill of terror ran through me. Should she indeed awake and see me and curse me and denounce the murderer? The thought was madness. It stirred the fiend within me. Not I, but she shall suffer. The murder I have committed because I am forever robbed of all that she could give me, she shall atone. I bent over her and placed the portrait securely in one of the folds of her dress. She moved again, and I fled. At length I wandered towards these mountains, and have ranged through their immense recesses, consumed by a burning passion which you alone can gratify. You must create a female for me with whom I can live. I demand it of you as a right which you must not refuse to concede. I replied, Shall I create another like yourself, whose joint wickedness might desolate the world? I will never consent. I swear to you that with the companion you bestow, I will quit the neighborhood of man and dwell in the most savage of places. My evil passions will have fled, for I shall meet with sympathy. His words had a strange effect upon me. You swear, I said, to be harmless? But have you not already shown a degree of malice that should reasonably make me distrust you? I am malicious because I am miserable, replied the fiend. Am I not shunned and hated by all mankind? I will revenge my injuries. If I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear, and chiefly towards you, my archenemy. I will work at your destruction, nor finish until I desolate your heart. What I ask of you is reasonable and moderate. I demand a creature of another sex, but as hideous as myself. Oh, my Creator, make me happy. Let me feel gratitude towards you for one benefit. I shuddered when I thought of the possible consequences of my consent, but I felt that there was some justice in his argument. He continued, If you consent, neither you nor any other human being shall ever see us again. I will go to the vast wilds of South America. My companion will be of the same nature as myself and will be content with the same fare. The picture I present to you is peaceful and human. How can you, replied I, who long for the love and sympathy of man, persevere in this exile? You will return and again seek their kindness, and you will meet with their detestation. Your evil passions will be renewed, and you will then have a companion to aid you in the task of destruction. How is this? I must not be trifled with, and I demand an answer. If I have no ties and no affections, hatred and vice must be my portion. The love of another will destroy the cause of my crimes, and I shall become a thing of whose existence everyone will be ignorant. Never will I create another like yourself, equal in deformity and wickedness. I cannot consent. Slave, remember that I have great power. You believe yourself miserable, but I can make you so wretched that the light of day will be hateful to you. Your threats cannot move me to do an act of wickedness. Are you to be happy while I grovel in the intensity of my wretchedness? You can blast my other passions, but revenge remains. I have declared my resolution to you, and I am no coward to bend beneath words. Leave me. I go, but remember, I shall be with you on your wedding night. All was again silent, but his words rang in my ears. I will be with you on your wedding night. That, then, was the period fixed for the fulfillment of my destiny. In that hour I should die, and at once satisfy and extinguish his malice. The labor of winding among the little paths of the mountain and fixing my feet firmly as I advanced perplexed me, occupied as I was by the emotions of the day. When I came to the halfway resting place and seated myself beside the fountain, I wept bitterly. Yet one duty remained to me, the recollection of which finally triumphed over my selfish despair. It was necessary that I should return without delay to Geneva, there to watch over the lives of those I so fondly loved. Thus I returned home, and entering the house, presented myself to Week after week passed away on my return to Geneva. But a change had taken place in me. My health was now much restored, and my spirits rose proportionably. My father saw this change with pleasure, and one day he called me to conversation. I am happy to remark, my dear son, that you have resumed your former pleasures and seem to be returning to yourself. I confess, my son, that I have always looked forward to your marriage with our dear Elizabeth as the tie of our domestic comfort and the stay of my declining years. You were attached to each other from your earliest infancy and appeared entirely suited to one another. You, perhaps, regard her as your sister without any wish that she might become your wife. My dear father, reassure yourself. I love my cousin tenderly and sincerely. My future hopes and prospects are entirely bound up in the expectation of our union. The expression of your sentiments of this subject, my dear Victor, gives me more pleasure than I have for some time experienced. Tell me, therefore, whether you object to an immediate solemnization of the marriage. I do not suppose, possessed as you are of a competent fortune, that an early marriage would at all interfere with any future plans of honor and utility that you may have formed. Such was my sentence, and on that night would the Damon employ every art to destroy me and tear me from the glimpse of happiness which promised partly to console my sufferings. On that night he had determined to consummate his crimes by my death. Well, be it so. A deadly struggle would then assuredly take place, in which, if he were victorious, I should be at peace, and his power over me be at an end. If he were vanquished, I should be a free man. "Have you, then, some other attachment?" asked my father. "None on earth. I love Elizabeth and look forward to our union with delight. Let the day, therefore, be fixed." I agreed with my father that if my cousin would consent, the ceremony should take place in 10 days. Preparations were made for the event, congratulatory visits were received, and all wore a smiling appearance. Through my father's exertions, a part of the inheritance of Elizabeth had been restored to her by the Austrian government. A small possession on the shores of Como belonged to her. It was agreed that, immediately after our union, we should proceed to Villa Lavenza and spend our first days of happiness beside the beautiful lake near which it stood. In the meantime, I took every precaution to defend my person in case the fiend should openly attack me. Indeed, as the period approached, the threat appeared more of a delusion, not to be regarded as worthy to disturb my peace. After the ceremony was performed, a large party assembled at my father's. It was agreed that Elizabeth and I should commence our journey by water, sleeping that night at Evian, and continuing our voyage on the following day. We passed rapidly along. The sun was hot, but we were sheltered from its rays by a kind of canopy while we enjoyed the beauty of the scene. The sun sank lower in the heavens. The wind, which had hitherto carried us along with amazing rapidity, sank at sunset to a light breeze. The soft air just ruffled the water and caused a pleasant motion among the trees as we approached the shore. It was 8 o'clock when we landed. We walked for a short time on the shore and then retired to the inn. The wind, which had fallen in the south, now rose with great violence in the west. Suddenly a heavy storm of rain descended. I had been calm during the day, but so soon as night obscured the shapes of objects, 1,000 fears arose in my mind. I was anxious and watchful. Elizabeth observed something in my glance which communicated terror to her, and she asked, "What is it, my dear Victor? What is it you fear?" "Oh, peace, peace, my love," replied I. "This night, and all will be safe, but this night is very dreadful." I passed an hour in this state of mind, when suddenly I reflected how fearful the combat which I momentarily expected would be to my wife, and I earnestly entreated her to retire. She left me, and I continued some time walking up and down the passages of the house, and inspecting every corner that might afford a retreat to my adversary. But I discovered no trace of him, and was beginning to believe that some fortunate chance had intervened to prevent the execution of his menaces, when suddenly I heard a shrill and dreadful scream. It came from the room into which Elizabeth had retired. As I heard it, the whole truth came into my mind. I rushed into the room. Why did I not then expire? Why am I here to relate the destruction of the best hope and the purest creature on earth? She was there, lifeless and inanimate. I rushed towards her and embraced her with ardor. The breath had ceased to issue from her lips. While I still hung over her in the agony of despair, I happened to look up. The shutters had been thrown back, and with a sensation of horror not to be described, I saw at the open window a figure the most hideous and abhorred. A grin was on the face of the monster. I rushed towards the window, and drawing a pistol from my bosom, fired. But he eluded me, and running with the swiftness of lightning, plunged into the lake. The report of the pistol brought a crowd into the room. I pointed to the spot where he had disappeared, and we followed the track with boats. Nets were cast, but in vain. After passing several hours, we returned hopeless, most of my companions believing it to have been a form conjured up by my fancy. I was bewildered in a cloud of wonder and horror. The death of William, the execution of Justine, and now of my wife. Even at that moment I knew not that my only remaining friends were safe from the malignity of the fiend. This idea made me shudder. I started up and resolved to return to Geneva with all possible speed. There were no horses to be procured, and I must return by the lake. But the wind was unfavorable, and the rain fell in torrents. However, it was hardly morning, and I might reasonably hope to arrive by night. I hired men to row and took an oar myself, for I had always experienced relief from mental torment in bodily exercise. But the overflowing misery I now felt, and the excess of agitation that I endured, rendered me incapable of any exertion. I threw down the oar, and leaning my head upon my hands, gave way to every gloomy idea that arose. A fiend had snatched from me every hope of future happiness. No creature had ever been so miserable as I was. But why should I dwell upon the incidents that followed this last overwhelming event? Mine has been a tale of horrors. Know that, one by one, my friends were snatched away. I was left desolate. My own strength is exhausted, and I must tell in a few words what remains of my hideous narration. I arrived at Geneva. My father and Ernest yet lived, but the former sunk under the tidings that I bore. The springs of existence suddenly gave way. He was unable to rise from his bed, and in a few days he died in my arms. What then became of me? I know not. I lost sensation. Sometimes, indeed, I dreamt that I wandered in flowery meadows and pleasant vales with the friends of my youth. By degrees, I gained a clear conception of my miseries. As the memory of past misfortunes pressed upon me, I began to reflect on their cause, the monster whom I had created. I began to reflect on the best means of securing him. My first resolution was to quit Geneva. I provided myself with a sum of money and departed. My first labor was to gain some clue by which I might trace the steps of my enemy. I wandered many hours round the confines of the town. Soon I found myself at the entrance of the cemetery where William, Elizabeth, and my father reposed. Everything was silent except the leaves of the trees. My grief quickly gave way to rage and despair. I knelt on the grass and with quivering lips exclaimed, "I swear to pursue the demon who caused this misery until he or I shall perish in mortal conflict. For this purpose I will preserve my life." I was answered through the stillness of night by a loud and fiendish laugh. Suddenly the moon arose and shone full upon his ghastly shape as he fled with more than mortal speed. I pursued him, and for many months this has been my task. I followed the windings of the Rhone, but vainly. The Mediterranean appeared, and I saw the fiend enter and hide himself in a vessel bound for the Black Sea. I took my passage in the same ship, but he escaped. Although he still evaded me, I have ever followed in his track. Sometimes the peasants informed me of his path. Sometimes he himself left some mark to guide me. The snows descended on my head, and I saw the print of his huge step on the white plain. Often, when all was dry, the heavens cloudless, and I was parched by thirst, a slight cloud would bedim the sky, shed the few drops that revived me, and vanish. I followed, when I could, the courses of the river, but the daemon generally avoided these. I had money with me and gained the friendship of several villagers by distributing it, or I brought with me some food that I had killed, which I always presented to those who had provided me with fire and utensils for cooking. My life, as it passed thus, was indeed hateful to me. What his feelings were whom I pursued, I cannot know. Sometimes he left marks in writing on the barks of the trees, or cut in stone that guided me and instigated my fury. Scoffing devil! Never will I give up my search until he or I perish. As I pursued my journey northward, the snows thickened and the cold increased in a degree almost too severe to support. The rivers were covered with ice, and no fish could be procured. The triumph of my enemy increased with the difficulty of my labors. Still, I continued with unabated fervor until the ocean appeared at a distance and formed the utmost boundary of the horizon. Covered with ice, it was only to be distinguished from land by its superior wildness and ruggedness. Some weeks before this period, I had procured a sledge and dogs, and thus traversed the snows with inconceivable speed. I found that I now gained on him, so much so that when I first saw the ocean, he was but 1 day's journey in advance. I pressed on, and in 2 days arrived at a hamlet on the seashore. I inquired of the inhabitants concerning the fiend and gained accurate information. He had carried off their store of winter food, and placing it in a sledge had pursued his journey across the sea. I exchanged my land sledge for one fashioned for the inequalities of the frozen ocean, and purchasing a plentiful stock of provisions, I departed from land. I cannot guess how many days have passed since then, but I have endured misery which nothing but the eternal sentiment of a just retribution could have enabled me to support. Immense and rugged mountains of ice often barred me up my passage, and I often heard the thunder of the ground sea, which threatened my destruction. But again the frost came and made the paths of the sea secure. I should guess that I had passed 3 weeks in this journey, and the continual protraction of hope often wrung bitter drops of despondency and grief from my eyes. Once, after the poor animals that conveyed me had gained the summit of a sloping mountain, my eye caught a dark speck upon the dusky plain. I uttered a wild cry of ecstasy when I distinguished a sledge and the distorted proportions of a well-known form within. Warm tears filled my eyes, which I hastily wiped away. But still my sight was dimmed by the burning drops until, giving way to the emotions that oppressed me, I wept aloud. I disencumbered the dogs, gave them a portion of food, and after an hour's rest I continued my route. The sledge was still visible, nor did I again lose sight of it. After 2 days' journey, I beheld my enemy at no more than a mile distant. My heart bounded within me. But now my hopes were suddenly extinguished, and I lost all trace of him. A ground sea was heard. The thunder of its progress became every moment more ominous and terrific. The sea roared. It split and cracked with a tremendous and overwhelming sound. In a few minutes, a tumultuous sea rolled between me and my enemy, and I was left drifting on a scattered piece of ice. In this manner, many hours passed. Several of my dogs died, and I myself was about to sink under the accumulation of distress when I saw your vessel. I quickly destroyed part of my sledge to construct oars, and by these means was enabled to move my ice raft in the direction of your ship. You took me on board when my vigor was exhausted, and I should soon have sunk under my multiplied hardships into a death which I still dread, for my task is unfulfilled. Oh, must I die, and he yet live? If I do, swear to me, Walton, that you will seek him and satisfy my vengeance in his death. And do I dare to ask of you to undertake my pilgrimage? No, I am not so selfish. Yet, if the ministers of vengeance should conduct him to you, 18. Swear that he shall not Walton, live. In continuation, August 26th. You have read this strange and terrific story, Margaret. I own to you that the apparition of the monster seen from our ship brought to me a greater conviction of the truth of his narrative than his asseverations, however earnest and connected. Thus has a week passed away, while I have listened to the strangest tale that ever imagination formed. My thoughts and every feeling of my soul have been drunk up by the interest for my guest which this tale and his own elevated and gentle manners have created. My beloved sister, September 2nd. I write to you encompassed by peril. I am surrounded by mountains of ice which admit of no escape and threaten every moment to crush my vessel. There is something terribly appalling in our situation, yet my courage and hopes do not desert me. Yet if we are lost, my mad schemes are the cause. September 5th. We are still surrounded by mountains of ice, still in imminent danger of being crushed in their conflict. The cold is excessive, and many of my unfortunate comrades have already found a grave amidst this scene of desolation. Frankenstein has daily declined in health. This morning I was roused by 6 of the sailors who demanded admission into the cabin. Their leader addressed me. He told me that he and his companions had been chosen by the other sailors to make me a requisition which, in justice, I could not refuse. We were immured in ice and should probably never escape, but they feared that if the ice should dissipate and a passage be opened, I should continue my voyage and lead them into fresh dangers. They insisted that I should engage with a solemn promise that if the vessel should be freed, and I would instantly direct my course southwards. I hesitated before I answered. I told them that I would not lead them farther north if they strenuously desired the contrary. It is past. I am returning to England. I have lost my hopes of utility and glory. September 12. September 9th, the ice began to move, and roarings like thunder were heard at a distance. We were in the most imminent peril, but as we could only remain passive, my chief attention was occupied by my unfortunate guest, whose illness increased in such a degree that he was entirely confined to his bed. The ice cracked behind us and was driven with force towards the north. A breeze sprang from the west, and on the 11th the passage towards the south became perfectly free. When the sailors saw this, a shout of joy broke from them. Frankenstein, who was dozing, awoke and asked the cause of the tumult. "They shout," I said, "because they will soon return to England." "Do you, then, really return?" "Alas, yes! I cannot withstand their demands. I cannot lead them unwillingly to danger, and I must return." "Do so, if you will, but I will not. You may give up your purpose, but mine is assigned to me by heaven, and I dare not. I am weak, but surely the spirits who assist my vengeance will endow me with sufficient strength." Saying this, he endeavored to spring from the bed, but the exertion was too great for him. He fell back and fainted. It was long before he was restored, and I often thought that life was entirely extinct. At length he opened his eyes. He breathed with difficulty and was unable to speak. I sat by his bed watching him. His eyes were closed, and I thought he slept. But presently he called to me in a feeble voice, and bidding me come near, said, "Alas! The strength I relied on is gone. I feel that I shall soon die, and he, my enemy and persecutor, may still be in being. Think not, Walton, that in the last moments of my existence I feel that burning hatred and ardent desire of revenge I once expressed, but I feel myself justified in desiring the death of my adversary. During these last days I have been occupied in examining my past conduct, nor do I find it blamable. In a fit of enthusiastic madness, I created a rational creature and was bound towards him to assure, as far as was in my power, his happiness and well-being. This was my duty, but there was another still paramount to that. My duties towards the beings of my own species had greater claims to my attention because they included a greater proportion of happiness or misery. Urged by this view, I refused, and I did right in refusing, to create a companion for the first creature. He showed unparalleled malignity and selfishness in evil. He destroyed my friends. He devoted to destruction beings who possessed exquisite sensations, happiness, and wisdom. Nor do I know where this thirst for vengeance may end. Miserable himself, that he may render no other wretched, he ought to die. The task of his destruction was mine, but I have failed. When actuated by selfish and vicious motives, I asked you to undertake my unfinished work, and I renew this request now, when I am only induced by reason and virtue. Yet I cannot ask you to renounce your country and friends to fulfill this task, and now that you are returning to England, you will have little chance of meeting with him. But the consideration of these points and the well-balancing of what you may esteem your duties, I leave to you. That he should live to be an instrument of mischief disturbs me. In other respects, this hour, when I momentarily expect my release, is the only happy one which I have enjoyed for several years." His voice became fainter as he spoke, and at length, exhausted by his effort, he sank into silence. He pressed my hand feebly, and his eyes closed forever. "Margaret, what can I say that will enable you to understand the depth of my sorrow? My mind is overshadowed by a cloud of disappointment, but I journey towards England, and I may there find consolation. It is midnight, the breeze blows fairly, and the watch on deck scarcely stir. Yet there is a sound as of a human voice coming from the cabin where Frankenstein lies still. I must arise and examine. What a scene has just taken place! I am yet dizzy with the remembrance of it. I entered the cabin where lay my ill-fated and admirable friend. Over him hung a form gigantic in stature. His face was concealed by long locks of ragged hair. But one vast hand was extended, in color and apparent texture like that of a mummy. When he heard the sound of my approach, he ceased to utter exclamations of grief and sprung towards the window. Never did I behold a vision so horrible as his face. I shut my eyes involuntarily and endeavored to recollect what were my duties with regard to this destroyer. I called on him to stay. He paused, and again turning towards the lifeless form of his creator, he seemed to forget my presence. "This is also my victim," he exclaimed. "Oh, Frankenstein, generous and self-devoted being, what does it avail that I now ask thee to pardon me?" His voice seemed suffocated, and my first impulses, which had suggested to me the duty of obeying the dying request of my friend, were now suspended by a mixture of curiosity and compassion. I attempted to speak, but the words died away on my lips. At length I gathered resolution to address him. "If you had listened to the voice of my conscience before you had urged your vengeance to this extremity, Frankenstein would yet have lived. It is well that you come here to whine over the desolation that you have made. If he whom you mourn still lived, still would he be the object of your accursed vengeance." "Oh, it is not thus," interrupted the being. "Yet such must be the impression conveyed to you by what appears to be the purport of my actions. Once I falsely hoped to meet with beings who, pardoning my outward form, would love me for the excellent qualities which I was capable of unfolding. But now crime has degraded me beneath the meanest animal. I cannot believe that I am the same creature whose thoughts were once filled with visions of the beauty and the majesty of goodness. You, who call Frankenstein your friend, seem to have a knowledge of my crimes and his misfortunes. But in the detail which he gave you of them, he could not sum up the hours and months of misery which I endured, wasting in impotent passions. Am I to be thought the only criminal, when all humankind sinned against me? But it is true that I am a wretch. I have devoted my Creator, the select specimen of all that is worthy of love and admiration among men, to misery. I have pursued him even to that irremediable ruin. You hate me, but your abhorrence cannot equal that with which I regard myself. Fear not that I shall be the instrument of future mischief. I shall quit your vessel on the ice raft which brought me thither, and shall seek the most northern extremity of the globe. I shall collect my funeral pile, and consume to ashes this miserable frame, that its remains may afford no light to any curious and unhallowed wretch who would create such another as I have been. I shall die. Farewell, Frankenstein, farewell." He sprang from the cabin window as he said this, upon the ice raft which lay close to the vessel. He was soon borne away by the waves and lost in darkness and distance.